Hello everyone, welcome to my patch 14.23 tier list. It has been a while since I made my last one, so in this video I'm going to make sure to discuss in depth some of the changes that I think that has happened to the meta lately, as well as some of the champs that have been directly or indirectly affected. As a reminder, if you have any questions about this tier list, you can always drop them in the comment section below, or when this video goes live, I will be live on twitch.tv/shoklol, so you can come and answer me some questions there as well. So before I go into individual champs, I'm just going to talk about the big meta changes as a whole, and I think the biggest one by far is the rune changes. So if you've been paying attention lately, you will have seen that a lot of champions that were previously running Electrocute or other keystones have kind of been looking towards sorcery keystones instead. And the reason for this is not even so much that Ahri or Comet or whatever is a far superior keystone to some of the other options, it's more that the minor runes in the sorcery tree and the precision tree are extremely overtuned. So if you run some sort of electrocute page like this, right? So this is your standard maybe like LeBlanc or Ahri page where you're running one of these, and then you're probably taking something like this. So the problem with this rune page is that you are either giving up the opportunity for Legend Haste and Cut Down, which are really, really good, right? Like Legend Haste is 15 ability haste for your basic abilities. This is quite important because there is not much ability haste readily available anymore. And Cut Down is also quite good in lane. Now, obviously you are getting CDR here, but it's a bit less. And you would have to either give up Mana Flow or Scorch. And that is also kind of a problem because if you do run this, you can't really do something like this because you'll be lacking mana without any mana runes, and then you won't actually be able to harass often enough to really use this Scorch. So you kind of have to do this. But the problem with this sort of page, like I said, is you're giving up precision, but also you're just giving up a ton of kind of like pre-6 lane strength especially. So Electrocute is really, really strong in skirmishes, but in laning phase is not that good because it's quite hard to proc unless you're in a lane where you can proc it really, really often. So you will see a lot of these champs going for something like this. And the nice thing about this is that you gain access to a lot of additional power, right? Like Ahri does more damage in lane than Electrocute, assuming you can proc it. You gain access to either Scorch or Gathering Storm, which enables either an early game playstyle or a scaling playstyle. And you get Cut Down, which is really, really good in the early game and the late game, plus all this extra ability haste. So yeah, there are champs like Ahri, Zoe, LeBlanc who are now going towards this. Now, on LeBlanc specifically, you can go something like this, which I think is quite good. That way you still get the sudden impact. But the main thing is that you're getting 3 in sorcery, and this is quite unique to LeBlanc because she uses sudden impact so well. Now, to kind of follow on from this, sometimes people are actually running Conqueror Primary on mages, which is kind of weird because there are not many mages that can use Conqueror Primary well. But the main reason, again, is because you really, really want these minor runes. And if you're in a lane against something that has D-Shield Second Wind and has a ton of sustain, so I've seen a lot of people doing this as, for example, like Hui against like Tank Galio. I've seen them actually going for Conqueror Primary. So in this case, this is quite good because it allows you to get the extra mana. And then you can go for some sort of page like this. And you can either drop Mana Flow and play something like this for ultra scaling because you don't need Mana Flow anymore with Presence of Mind, or we can still go for this if we need maximum mana. And again, this is kind of just better than what you would get for running those other pages. So that's quite interesting. I think this has changed the meta a fair amount because it means that there's a lot more early game strength available, right? Like it's a lot harder for you to play some sort of scaling electrocute page when your opponent is playing some super lane dominant like Ahri page. Now, coming to the meta, and when I actually go through the champs, that is important because like some of these champs up here that were maybe like, scaling counterpicks or whatever, I think are a little bit harder to play. And if you're a champ that doesn't have a way of using these trees well, like if your champ is kind of required to take some sort of scaling setup or is, requires some tree outside of, precision or sorcery, I think that can be a little harder. So yeah, just keep in mind that there's a lot more Ahri pages, a lot more Conqueror pages, and, obviously Comet and Phase are running around. The TLDR is that these two rune pages are really, really broken. Now, something else that is kind of impacted by that is you guys might remember there was that minion change to where it's kind of meant to incentivize roaming. Personally, I don't think this made a huge difference. I think that the problem with that is that like it's very, very difficult to play the sort of roaming champ that just sacks waves and runs bot because like the punishment is so high, right? Like if you roam bot and it doesn't work out, you lose a wave, you lose a play, and suddenly you're extremely, extremely far behind. So roaming in the champs that do it well are still reliant on being able to get prior, and that prior might come from having a strong lane, right? Like for example, a champ like Ahri or LeBlanc are good at roaming, but oftentimes it's because they have so much gang set up and they're actually quite strong 1v1 that they're able to get prior and roam, and that way you can make a successful roam without losing anything. So I don't think the minion change thing really made a difference, at least not in the games that I've seen. And I guess maybe it makes a difference in lower elos where people are like punishing you less hard. You might be able to roam like a bit more freely. But at least in high elo, all it's really meant is that like Prio is just as important as ever. And surprise, surprise, the most important thing for getting Prio is laning strength. So that kind of further incentivizes this sort of rune page. Now, with enough yapping out of the way, I will first go through the S tiers, and then I will go through specific champions on the list. So Ori, I've still got as the highest champ on the list. I think that Ori can be blind picked, mainly because she's so OP. She can be, she makes use of all these different rune pages. You can play Conqueror Ori, you can play Phase Rush, Aerie, Comet. She can use basically anything. Like I said, super solid blind as well into basically everything, and also pairs well with pretty much every AD jungler. She's really good with like Jarvan or Viego, can play with Skarner. So I think just overall, in terms of like blind pickability and usefulness, she's really, really good. I do think that like if you're counterpicking, chances are there will be something that's more valuable than Ori. Like if I were counterpicking, I would probably go for something like a Syndra. It is completely fine to blind or to counterpick with Ori, but I think you could get more out of some greedier pick. But just, yeah, it's just super solid. Basically never bad. If you wanted to be an Ori one trick, I think it's completely fine. Next is Akshan. So Akshan is extremely broken in solo queue right now. This is mainly because of how overtuned Shiv is and how well he uses it. So I think that Akshan is, you still have to be a little careful with him, right? Like you do need to snowball, I think, and I think you do prefer to have an AP jungler. So maybe you don't want to pick him like literally every game. That being said, the Akshan one tricks always seem to have really high win rates. So like it seems like it's going to be pretty strong. And a lot of the time, the champs that do counter Akshan in lane, if they do make a mistake, can obviously end up in a really, really bad spot. So I think it's pretty solid. Next, we have Ahri. So kind of similar to Ori, Ahri is a really, really good blind pick. She does have some bad matchups. Actually, she has several bad matchups, but like most of the bad matchups are very gankable, right? So Ahri loses to things like Syndra and Ori, but those champs are very gankable. And if you have the right sort of champ, again, like a Viego or a Jarvan or Lee Sin, you will be able to punish these sorts of champs. I also think that Ahri's going for the Aerie page has made her a lot stronger into lots of other champs. Not necessarily these ones because they outrange you still a little bit, but there are champs before that, maybe the lane would be even against Ahri, and now Ahri might be slightly favored. She uses the Aerie page really well because it's really easy for her to W forward and just get a quick auto and run away, or go for the auto and then W to run away. So it's really good for Ahri, I think, running the Aerie page. Also, the extra CDR is really nice as well. Really, the only downside is you're not getting Ultimate Hunter, but I think it's super, super solid. Now, Syndra is in S tier. I would say Syndra, though, mainly gains value as a flex pick / counter. So Syndra counter pick is super broken, right? Like Syndra wins lane and scales. So unless you get punished super hard in the early game, either by the jungle or by your mid matchup, you're going to be insanely, insanely fed. I think Syndra is one of the best one tricks to play at the moment because, even if you do fall behind or even if you don't get ahead in the early game, you don't manage to snowball, you still just have that super scaling win condition, which is super, super nice. So yeah, I think Syndra is insane. And again, like probably the premier counter pick on the patch. If you ever get an excuse to pick Syndra, you probably should. Moving down to our A tier, I'll talk about some of the champs in here. So the first one is Zoe. So I've been having a ton of success on Zoe running the Aerie precision page, not taking Electrocute and not taking Ignite at all. And in lane, you can actually trade extremely hard. It's very easy for you to proc Aerie either with empowered orders or just like with a little bit of Q poke. Think she's a lot stronger in lane than people give her credit for. I do think that she can struggle into some matchups, but like at the same time, Zoe's a sort of champ where like if you hit a bubble, suddenly the matchup completely changes. I also think she's a really, really good counter pick. She's amazing against Sylas. I think she's very good against Ahri as well. And she's good against a lot of these like greedier picks here. So Zoe, similar to Syndra, is one of the premier counter picks on this patch. You do have to be a little more careful of engage comps. For example, there's champs like Leona that can make Zoe's life extremely difficult. But outside of that, you can play her basically whenever, and I actually think she's, yeah, like I said, super underrated. I guess one little thing for Zoe is that the second item is very important. I think Lichbane on Zoe is really, really good, but if you can't go Lichbane, she's a lot weaker. And the most important thing for being able to buy Lichbane is being able to buy the needlessly large rod. So if you have enough gold to buy needlessly large rod, then you're doing great. If you fall behind though, and you end up with something like Aether-Wisp Sheen, like you just can't build Lichbane, right? Like the item is just, the build path is just too trash if you have to build it like that. And then I think you are weakening yourself. Things like Horizon or Storm Surge or whatever, like they can be built, but I don't think they're as OP as Lichbane. Lichbane is like really core to the champ, I think. Another one is LeBlanc. So this could be slightly lower than it should be. I'm not 100% sure. So the thing is, I think that LeBlanc can use this Aerie page. I think the problem is that like LeBlanc is a little more reliant on Electrocute in the mid game than some of these other champs. Like you think of a champ like Ahri, even though she doesn't have Electrocute, it's not like she needs to burst people down. Whereas I think for LeBlanc, LeBlanc is sort of a poke champ, but like having Electrocute to, you know, burst someone or one-shot an AD carry is kind of important. That being said, like LeBlanc is still extremely strong in lane, especially with the Ahri sudden impact page. So this is something I have to experiment with a little more. There's a lot of like overlap between LeBlanc and Ahri. Like a lot of the time, one is just better than the other because they're so similar. I have a feeling that Ahri is better than LeBlanc at the moment, but I think one thing about LeBlanc is if your opponent doesn't know how to play into it, oftentimes it's a free win. Like it's really, really important that you take bone plating against LeBlanc, for example, and a lot of people just don't know that. So you just get like a free win some of the time. So yeah, I don't know. It could probably be a little bit higher, maybe depending on if you're blinding it or not. It could be a little lower, but I still think it's very, very strong. Another one to talk about is Corki. So Corki received some pretty major buffs, and there's a couple different builds that you can play. So most people play the Conqueror Corki build, which I think is quite good. So you go, I think it's like tier Triforce Manamune RFC most of the time, and with Conqueror you deal a lot of damage. It's really, really good in those extended trades. Now, some people do still run the Hail of Blades page where you go Collector IE. I think this is not as good as before. I was playing it a lot on the previous patch, but obviously like Collector got nerfed a tiny bit. I also think that as champions are getting a bit stronger in lane, you know, because of like more early game pages, depending on what sort of champ it is, you can't actually W forward into them, because like if they have some sort of CC or, you know, some way to push you away, like for example, you can't really W onto Zoe because she'll EU. It's difficult to W onto Syndra because she'll stun you. You know, same with Ahri. Like there's kind of like difficult champs to W onto. So in those sorts of matchups, you definitely can't play Halo Blades. I think Halo Blades is best against champs, you know, maybe like Ori, that you can W onto freely and just like punish them. That being said, like the Halo Blades build does scale a lot worse, and I think it is probably better to go Conquer, but yeah, it's like there are probably some matchups that are hard enough, like the Ori matchup, where like you won't be able to run Conqueror because you'll just be too weak early compared to all their strong, you know, early game runes. I would say you should try avoid those matchups. Like I think you want to try be using Corki as a counter, especially into melees. I think is really, really good, but also into some of the weaker laning mages, or at least the mages that don't have a way to really punish you for Wing forward. I think that can be quite nice. The next three I'm going to talk about kind of together. So Taliyah, Galio, and Lissandra I all think are super, super strong counter picks at the moment. I think Taliyah might be the greediest counter pick on the patch, but perhaps the most rewarding. If you go into Korean solo queue and you look at a lot of the high ranked players, a lot of them do have Taliyah games kind of scattered in their match history here and there. I think Taliyah is one of those champs that like if you pick it in the right comp or you don't get punished in lane, it's absolutely ridiculous. That being said, it has some really, really rough meta matchups. Like I think playing Taliyah into like Syndra, Ori, Zoe, LeBlanc is all like very miserable. So it really has to be a counterpick champ, and it gets a lot of additional value the more melee champs the enemy team has. If you're playing against something like, I don't know, you end up against like Syndra, Caitlyn, Lux, you know, like that sort of game Taliyah is going to be useless. On the other hand, if you end up against champs that do have to come into you, they've got a bunch of melees or they have tanks, it's really good. I also think Taliyah is the premier tank killer out of like all the viable mids. Like if we just take kind of like everything in S or A tier, Taliyah is the best AP at killing tanks and Corki is the best AD at killing tanks. So if you need some sort of tank killer because they just have like a ton of beefy boys, Taliyah is definitely your go-to. Galio and Liss, I think, are both still very strong. The main reason I have them a bit lower is for, well, a couple reasons. Galio is getting a little more punished now because Corki's back in meta, and Tristana is being picked more as a counter to Galio. So he's lost a little bit of value as a blind pick because now he can be countered a little harder by these champs that are coming in, like especially these AD carries. I do think the best Galio build is the tank AP build, so you really do want to be playing into an AP mid. And now, you know, like, it's like before, I think you could ban Yon and you're basically guaranteed to verse an AP mid. But now I've got like Akshan, Corki, and Tristana as well, which makes life kind of difficult. Lissandra has also a little bit of value too, and that's mainly because now like everyone having stronger lanes is kind of bad for Lissandra. Like Lissandra can use the Ahri page, but she can't proc it as often as, you know, some of the champs up here. There are some matchups like Lissandra versus Syndra where the Syndra, if she took first strike, was actually quite playable for Lissandra. But in the 1v1, if Syndra takes Comet or whatever, it's very, very difficult. You are very reliant on having your jungler come and assist you, and I think for that it's normally better to be Ahri or LeBlanc. That being said, Still a great counter if you know, it's quite good into Ahri, especially if you're scared of getting ganked. You can definitely play it into LeBlanc still, although, you know, if LeBlanc is low prior, then Lissandra does too. You can play Lissandra into basically any assassin as well, or dive comp, and it's very, very good. Just maybe not quite as strong as it was before. Another one worth talking about is Aurora. So Aurora got a rework this patch to change her ult to no longer be a cage. They also gave her increased range on her Q and E. They did some other minor changes, like they got rid of her passive move speed, moved it for her W, and they did a bunch of different things. TLDR, I think Aurora is still really, really good. She's definitely a little bit different from before, and like, I think she is maybe less focused on just like ulting people and one-shotting them, kind of like before, where you could just like, you know, get a big ult and that was basically all you needed to do. I think now, like, maybe a little more important to DPS, and we'll kind of see how this ends up panning out, because it might be that you need to play some CDR focused build, like maybe you do need to go, say, Malignance into, I don't know, Legendary, or maybe you need to go Malignance into Cosmic. Potentially you just go super amounts of CDR on your runes, and then you go for something like Blackfire Legendary, you know, like that could work. I've played 2 games of Aurora this patch, and at least early game it still feels very good. I think into mages, like Emax with Comet is very, very nice as well, with the tiny bit of extra range. I've also seen Aurora top this patch with Grasp, and it still looks very, very good, going for some sort of, I think it was like first item Leandry, kind of like what Aurora used to do, where she would just build tank and be basically unkillable, while also dealing like a ton of damage. So I'm not 100% certain on what is the best way to play Aurora at the moment, but I'm pretty certain the champ is still very strong. Increased ult duration is really, really nice, and a 75% slow is, I think, some of the time actually more impactful maybe than caging people in the circle. I think also one other thing that impacts it is that Aurora is probably more difficult to play now than she was before, because again, before, like, she definitely had a high skill cap, but you could basically just like W forward and get a big ult, and that was your job done. I think now, like, there is a bit more incentive on getting multiple rotations off and like using your ulti bounces properly. So a little bit harder than before. And I think overall maybe a very slight nerf, but to me it still feels like she's a very, very strong champion. One that I get questions about all the time on stream is the Swain rework, and what do I think? So overall, I think the Swain rework hasn't really changed his place in the meta. I think for the most part, he has the same problems as before, of you kind of need to be playing into a bunch of short range, and I think his lane phase is still relatively weak. I will say, though, there is one big change to Swain, which is that because you can ult multiple times, you're much less reliant on having Ghost. And that's a really big deal, because it means that you can take Flash TP, and I think that's very important, because the problem you had before was that, like, you had to give up. If you gave up Flash and took TP Ghost, you were still very, very gankable, right? Especially by champs like Jarvan. If you gave up your TP, you were extremely vulnerable to basically any ranged laner. You'd get bullied out super, super hard. But now being able to take Flash TP and still be relevant in team fights means that you aren't as susceptible to some of those like bad situations. And I think, again, it is still better if you use Swain as a counter pick, like, and try pick him into shorter range comms or freer matchups. But if you're a Swain one trick, you're just playing Swain every game, you'll probably find that the difficult matchups, while still difficult, are less punishing than they were before, and maybe they're not like the free loss that they were. You know, I think playing Swain as something like Syndra or Ori was just like insta GG before. I think now it's like, okay, maybe you can like get through the lane, and hopefully you can be useful in the mid game. So again, still a counter pick, has a lot of the same problems as before, but those problems are mitigated a little bit, and I think, yeah, should be picked a little bit more than before. Azir had an AP ratio on his W buff this patch, which is kind of nice, right? Like, AP ratio on W, the ability that you're going to be using the most, does add up to a lot of additional damage late game. I think the problem is, though, that like AP ratio, you don't really feel the extra damage from that until you have like a fair amount of AP, you know, in the later stages of the game. So I don't think the change really like moves Azir around in the meta. But again, like, if you were counterpicking him, like, I think it makes those situations better. Or if you were in a 0-1 trick, you'll probably find that, you know, if you do get to late game, he's a little stronger than before. I played a few games of Azir this patch, and he actually still feels pretty good. You know, like, I think Azir is kind of underrated at the moment. I've definitely seen him, even before the patch, being picked a little bit in high-low Korean solo queue. People trying to make him work with stuff like Arians arranged and then Conqueror or PTA into melee. So definitely a pickable champ. Probably still not worth the trouble. I think there's champs that scale harder and they're much easier, like Syndra. But yeah, I think Azir is still pretty underrated. If you do get a good matchup for him, where you get a game that you think is going to go long, I think he's very, very good. I lightly mentioned before Tristana, and Tristana's coming a bit more popular for a couple of reasons. So first off, Tristana bot is becoming more popular, which is because of, I think, a new Essence Reaver build that people are using. I'm not sure if this is good mid, because I think the build path might be a bit too weak. But either way, like, because Tristana is becoming more popular bot, the flex pick potential means that she's a bit more valuable mid. She is also a really, really good counter to Galio, so just for that reason alone, you can kind of stop people from blinding Galio, which is super nice. I have seen a bit more Tristana just in general into other things, I guess because sometimes like the AD mids do just get banned out. You know, you'll see a lot of like the Yone or the Corki get banned, and so then people might start reaching for these sort of champs. I don't think it's the sort of champ that you want to blind. You know, like now that they've nerfed the AD mid sustain heavily, it's difficult to blind and then verse like Syndra or Hui or something that can stop you from jumping onto them. But if you get a good matchup, Tristana is still pretty solid, and the flex pick potential also is great. Also want to talk about Viktor. So I get asked about Viktor probably more than any other champ on my stream. I swear, literally every day I must answer like 10 questions about Viktor. So I'll give you my full thoughts on Viktor. I think Viktor he's a pretty underrated champ, right? You can see I have him like relatively high up in the B tier. I think he's pretty solid. The main reason that Viktor isn't played more, though, is because Syndra is just a much better version of Viktor. It's pretty much as simple as that. So the thing with Viktor is that he is very, very strong in lane, and he scales extremely well. But he's not very good at skirmishing, and he has no gank setup and no mobility. So if you compare Viktor to a champ like Syndra, it's like Viktor is slightly stronger in lane than Syndra, and Viktor scales slightly better than Syndra as well. But he has those major downsides. Syndra has gank setup, Viktor does not. Syndra has self-peel that is much more effective than Viktor's, and also Syndra can skirmish early, whereas Viktor cannot. So it's kind of like, the main reason you don't see this more is simply put that there is a better version of Viktor. But that doesn't mean that Viktor is bad. In fact, like, Viktor is actually a pretty solid champ. I think could probably be picked more. Has good matchups into some things. Like, I think he's quite good into Ahri. I think he's good into Taliyah. I think he's probably... he might be good versus Corki if he's playing Conqueror. So there's definitely, like, matchups you can look to play the Viktor in. But it's just, like, in any one of these cases, like, wouldn't you prefer to play Syndra? I think probably. I also think Syndra is probably easier than Viktor these days, which is kind of weird because Syndra used to be insanely hard, but they've just made her so much easier. And nowadays, I think that there's just not much point to play Viktor over Syndra, assuming you can play them both. That being said, Viktor is getting a mini rework soon, so if you wanted to start playing him now in preparation for the mini rework, like, I think that's fine. And yeah, he's super fun. I do love Viktor, and I wish he had a niche more than anything. Like, if he were even crazier scaling than Syndra, could be really good, or if they just like completely leaned into his lane bully and he was just like the strongest laning mage by a mile, I think that could be good. But currently he just doesn't really have a niche, and the payoff is not really worth it. Last one in the B tier I want to talk about is Smolder. So Smolder received a bunch of changes this patch, mainly trying to make him more viable in solo queue, I think, and sort of nerfing his strength of like scaling with stacks and more making sure it scales with goals. So like there's less of a time bomb of just Smolder scaling from stacking, and also so that if he does fall behind, he is a bit more punished just because he doesn't have enough gold. So I have a feeling that Smolder is going to be slightly better this patch. Personally, I haven't actually seen or played against a Smolder mid yet. I have seen it in some people's match histories, and they seem to be doing okay with it. That being said, like, I think people are still running kind of the same build, and I'm not sure if that's the best, you know, so I think this might take a little while to kind of figure out what's the best. I think he's going to be slightly better, though, and also, before this patch even came through, Smolder was still getting a lot of play mid in high reloads. Not a ton, like not as high as the champs up here, but again, you would go to people's match histories in Korea, and you would see Smolder there. So Smolder probably being used more as a counter pick. There are some champs where like if you just can't get punished and you scale for free, it's extremely strong. And yeah, we'll kind of have to keep an eye on this. Like, this could be a completely wrong rating, to be honest. I think that's where it should go right now. But maybe on the next tier list, I'll have a more accurate reading on it. The very last one I want to talk about is Ambessa. So I think Ambessa is a really, really strong champ, but the problem is that her laning phase, especially into poke, is pretty weak. So I think in mid lane, she is not really that good. Like, she gets poked out too much. Maybe if you could pick it into a champ that can't punish you and you get free scaling, or, you know, if you can play against some sort of melee that you can beat early, I think it could be good. For me, like, Ambessa seems like she's much better in jungle or top, where she can't be punished so much. That being said, if you do want to play Ambessa mid, you know, maybe there's flex picks potential there. Maybe the players you're against still don't know what the champ does, which, like, can't really be overlooked, right? Like, that is a relevant factor. If you get a random kill because they don't know what your ult does or whatever, that is super, super nice. So yeah, I think probably if you are going to play mid, just use it as a counter pick. I do believe it's just better in top and jungle, but, you know, maybe adds a little bit of potential. Maybe, I don't know. We'll keep an eye on it. I think that is going to be it for this tier list. Sorry for not making one for a while. I am now back in OC, having finished my bootcamp, and I will post a video tomorrow talking about those bootcamps and then upcoming plans. As a reminder, if you guys have any questions about anything on this tier list, please drop them in the comment section below, or come over to twitch.tv/ShockLol. I will be streaming probably for like 7 hours or so after this video goes live. So yeah, come over there, give me a follow, and let me know what your thoughts or questions are. Don't forget to like and subscribe. See you guys in the next one.